Um, okay, yep. So my name is Ryan Waldron. I'm a librarian at the Grimsby Public Library, and I'm happy to present two speakers tonight from the Grimsby Historical Society, Ev Page and Dorothy Turcotte. They're both volunteers at the Historical Society, and they've been doing some research about Grimsby during World War II, and they will present their research for us tonight. Dorothy Turcotte is the author of several books on the history of Grimsby, including her most recent book, More Gleanings from Grimsby. And at the end of the presentation, will be a slide with some information about how to purchase that book, that new book. And we also have her other older books at the Grimsby Library, and those are also for sale through various outlets around town. So without any further ado, I will just turn it over to Ev Page and Dorothy Turcotte to share the research on Grimsby during World War II.
Good evening. A year ago, the Grimsby Historical Society volunteers began to plan an open house to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. We were in the very early stages of gathering information when COVID-19 appeared. Before long, our office was closed, and that put an end to our plans. Tonight, though, we want to share with you the results of some of our research by looking at what life was like in Grimsby during World War II. This morning, the Canadian Legion honoured our armed forces. Now we would like to honour the citizens of Grimsby for all the work they did to help our men and women in uniform and support our allies overseas.
I remember very well the first day when World War II was declared. I was swinging in a hammock at our cottage at Burlington Beach, listening to some music, when suddenly it was interrupted by the announcement that the war had been declared. Even as a child, I knew this was pretty important because I'd been listening to the adults. If a German submarine or bomber could have penetrated this far into North America, and that was not without possibility, Hamilton would be the perfect target because it was one of Canada's main industrial centers. Now, I didn't grow up in Grimsby, I grew up in Hamilton, but I imagine that our lives were very much similar in many ways. We did not suffer like those in England and Europe, but we were reminded daily of the war. For example, there were windshield stickers to identify the driver's category for buying gasoline. Ours was AA, the very lowest, so we didn't go very far. There were also coupons for sugar, butter, and meat. The Wartime Prices and Trades Board was very strict about rules for use of the coupons and the setting of the prices. An article in the Independent in 1943 warned butter retailers not to accept expired butter coupons. Apparently some did, in the expectation that by turning in more coupons, they would be allowed to buy more butter. But the Wartime Prices and Trades Board was onto that and was not allowed. In school, we bought war savings stamps for 25 cents each. And when you had collected $5 worth on a sheet, you folded it up and sent it off to the address on the cover and received a certificate worth $5 to be redeemed later on. That means, I guess, after the war. It was an early lesson in savings, and adults were encouraged to buy war-saving bonds when they could. My mother knit a lot for the Canadian Red Cross. They delivered wool to her and patterns and picked them up again. She made scarves, mitts, gloves, sweaters, balaclava helmets, and seamen's stockings, which were very heavy yarn because they were meant to be worn under rubber boots. When looking at a page from the Independent in April 1942, I was interested to see that the Red Cross was notifying knitters that they no longer wanted turtleneck sweaters for the Army or the the full-length seamen's stockings. I remember these stockings, I think, were held up by a heavy duty form of the garters that we use for silk stockings. Not that I wore silk stockings at that stage in my life, but I remember them very well. At the end of the war, my mom was awarded a silver pin from the Red Cross, like other knitters. My own contribution was at first to knit wristlets, where 6-inch rib sections meant to bridge the gap between sleeves and mitts and thus keep the men's arms warm. As the war wore on and I grew older, I learned how to turn a heel, and I graduated to knitting socks. Incidentally, the Red Cross supplied 3 shades of yarn: khaki for the Army, navy blue, and a lighter Air Force blue for the RCAF. We never wondered what happened to the knitted goods after they left us, but now we know that the Red Cross sent them to a mansion in Essex, and from there they were distributed as needed to the troops. It was not uncommon for men to lose their entire kit during combat, and new items would be supplied by the Canadian Red Cross. Sailors were particularly at risk of losing their belongings, as their ships often were torpedoed, and when that happened, the ship did not necessarily sink immediately, but water would rush through and wash away all their belongings. In 1914, the Canadian Red Cross had built a military hospital at Taplow in Buckinghamshire, on the property called Cliveden, owned by the Astor family. Built with Royal Canadian Red Cross funds, the hospital was at first called the Duchess of Connaught Red Cross Hospital. The Duchess was Princess Louise Margaret of Prussia, who at the time was the international president of the Red Cross. There was a strong Canadian connection between this country and the Astors because John Jacob Astor made his vast fortune through the Canadian fur trade. The hospital was enlarged during the Second World War and was used again as a military hospital. And after the war, it was used by the community and at one time was also used as a research center for children's arthritis. And I was fortunate to be able to visit it at that time. In 1985, when the hospital became derelict, it was a popular place to be haunted by ghost hunters. The property had been donated to the National Trust by the Astor family for protection, but even that did not prevent it from eventually becoming a housing development. Here in Grimsby, a group of women, formerly known as the Junior League, became a branch of the Canadian Red Cross. They opened the White Elephant shop, approximately where the Dutch shop is now, and sold many used items as well as some of their own handcrafts. The group raised enough money to buy a van that saw service overseas, and they provided many of the other necessities and comforts for which the Red Cross was famous. The van was later turned over to the West Lincoln Memorial Hospital, Ladies Auxiliary, for their use. At that time, most newspapers had women's pages. The Grimsby Independent was no exception. Browsing through some of those pages after the war, I see that the Grimsby housewives were encouraged to serve their families more turnips, a nutritious winter vegetable that many people don't like because of its rather strong, bitter flavor. This issue of the Independent provided a turnip and potato pie recipe, as well as the tip that turnips taste better if a little sugar is added to the vegetable after cooking. Readers were also reminded that it was patriotic to serve turnips because they are Canadian. I don't know if that's really true. I think they grow in other places as well. But every women's page included wholesome, easy to prepare recipes such as shepherd's pie and fish dishes. This, of course, because women were out working and didn't have the time to spend on cooking that they had previously had. They all had jobs, or many had jobs, because the men were away fighting. There were also tips on these women's pages about things like cleaning your jewelry and other housewifely affairs, as well as a weekly poem. I know once Bill Deckman asked me if I would write a column in the Independent for women, of interest to women. And I remarked, well, women are interested in everything, to which he sighed and said, I guess you're right. On another occasion, an article from Bell Telephone urged users to make only necessary calls and to keep them short. Now, I'm not sure how telephone conversations, shorter telephone conversations could have helped the war effort, but apparently it did. But this article also included some really good tips for telephone etiquette, um, which, well, could still be applicable today. For example, the onus is on the person who called to bring the conversation to an end. How often do we observe that? And when hanging up, to do so gently so as not to chip the other person's ear. Another article from the Canada Post Office suggested saving used postage stamps. Apparently, 300 pounds of used postage stamps could be shipped very cheaply to be used as fundraisers by English children. The stamps could be used in crafts or were put into packages and sold to stamp collectors. This article also squashed the rumor that used postage stamps were being recycled by the post office to use the vegetable dyes. This would have been very costly and time consuming, and I'm sure was not considered during the war. The Independent, dated March 5th, 1942, told readers that children from English cities were being evacuated to a Tudor mansion in Ickleford, Herefordshire, where the Waifs and Strays Society administered a home on behalf of the Canadian Red Cross. There, the children would be safe from the savage bombing of London and other large centers. I went to Earl Kitchener School in Hamilton, and we had 3 refugees, as we called them. I think they were all upper class kids brought over to live for the duration with relatives or family friends. They wore school blazers, so going to a public school like ours must have been quite a shock for them. But everyone wanted to be their friend, so they were never too lonely, I'm sure. But just think of those 11, 12, 13-year-old kids so far from their families, knowing that their families at home might be in danger of bombing, and having risked danger themselves to come across the submarine-infested ocean by ship. I wonder if any refugee children came to Grimsby. I haven't heard of any, but I'd like to. In September 1940, only a few months after the Women's Council for Reception of Children had been formed to organize the evacuation of 21 English children to Canada, Australia, or New Zealand, a tragedy ended this plan. The SS City of Benares was carrying among its passengers 90 children and some of their family members when the ship was torpedoed. Of the passengers, 77 children were lost, and only one small family group emerged intact. After that, there were no more overseas evacuations by ship.
During the war, Ada Bromley was named the hospitality convener for the local IODE. Due to Ada's impeccable records, we are so lucky to have a complete list of Grimsby's servicemen and women. The records show the home address, the next of kin, plus the service address of every soldier, and also the airmen and sailors too, so that boxes of knitted hats and socks and cigarettes could be sent to them on a regular basis. In 1942, a unique program was established. Hospitality homes for RAF men and women who were on leave from Mount Hope and Galt. Local citizens stepped up to the plate and 39 homes became available. Servicemen and women would spend a 36 or 48-hour leave in Grimsby, and it would also appear that on occasion, a man could stay longer if he was convalescing from an illness or a wound. Many servicemen would request to come to Grimsby to make the connections and to work on one of the fruit farms, while enjoying, obviously, some home-cooked meals. If they wanted to attend church while they were here, they would be hosted by a family of the same faith. It was interesting to see that on occasion, Ada contacted the family of an airman to let them know he was part of the hospitality program and was enjoying his visits to Grimsby. While many of the families were in the UK, there were one or two from Australia and New Zealand. By the end of 1944, 211 servicemen had been given home hospitality in Grimsby through the families who supported the IODE program. The IODE was also responsible for welcoming war brides. According to the records, 42 young women were welcomed to Grimsby, plus one war groom. He was Lieutenant R.S. Holland. He had been one of the airmen welcomed to Grimsby during the hospitality program, and he fell in love with his host's daughter, Agnes Fitzgerald. Holland came back to Canada after the war to claim his wife. They married and raised their daughters in Grimsby. It is unfortunate that due to the norms of that time, war brides aren't listed in Ada's book, as you can see a page here, with their first names, but rather Mrs. Jack Hildreth or Mrs. Reg Ballard. So we don't really know their first names. But I do wonder what challenges they faced when they came and setting up new lives in Grimsby. No longer would their husband be a soldier or an airman or a sailor. Now he worked on a farm, or maybe one of the factories in Hamilton. It must have been like getting used to a whole new person. Fitting in with his family could also have been a challenge, but hopefully you were welcomed. The Farmerette program again was coordinated by Ada, and her records again are amazing, and we're so proud to have them. So once again, as in World War I, young women came to Grimsby to work on the farms. But this time they were joined by high school students who wanted to help. Maybe their older brothers were in the armed forces in Europe and they needed to be of help. So they could help in the spring and the fall, the busy times on the farm. It was also noted that 3 of the girls married local men. An article in The Independent in September 9, 1943 refers to the need of ditty bags. They were requested for the Merchant Navy. This was by no means the first request, but I found it interesting because this was basically a Christmas drive. The article stated that the Merchant Marine was responsible for getting packages of foodstuffs to England for our soldiers, and also food and clothing for our cousins in England. And let's not forget, as Dorothy mentioned earlier, the Atlantic shipping lanes were rife with U-boats. It would appear that the Grimsby branch of the Navy League was only 19 months old, but had done a great job so far. The person to contact was Mrs. Buddy Schaefer. She said in the article that she had 88 filled bags and another 250 to be filled by October 15th, and this would hopefully get a shipment to England for Christmas. On page 7 of the same issue, there were letters of thanks from seamen who had received ditty bags from previous shipments. One seaman commented on the wide assortment of things he received, all of which are needed at sea. He also said every item in the bag would be used. In fact, he'd already mended his trousers and he was going to darn his socks that night. It was interesting to learn from his letter that every item had been wrapped separately.
One of the good things to come out of the war for Grimsby was our first hospital. In December 1942, Dr. J.M. McMillan and businessman Sandy Globe had their famous conversation on the post office steps. They agreed that something had to be done to establish a hospital in Grimsby, particularly some of our boys would be coming home soon, we hoped, with medical problems that could be dealt with locally. Sandy Gold promised to put the matter of fundraising to his fellow members of the Grimsby Lions Club. They received the idea with enthusiasm and began work at once. C.J. Eames, who was well known in both Grimsby and Hamilton, offered to donate the clubhouse and surrounding property of the Deer Park Golf Course for the hospital building. His only condition was that the Lions Club raise $15,000 and that the public come up with $20,000 for renovations and equipment. The property had previously belonged to John Hewitt, a Grimsby native who spent many years in Chicago producing printing machinery. When he returned to his home in Grimsby for his retirement, he was astonished at the number of deer on his property. He fenced it as a wild game preserve and called it Deer Park. That name is perpetuated in Deer Park Villa, the extended care residence associated with West Lincoln Memorial Hospital. And at that time, too, the name of the hospital was chosen as a permanent memorial to Grimsby area heroes of the two world wars. The hospital opened on January 7, 1946. A pre-opening tour for local residents brought out 600 of the curious to have a look. During the first month, 46 patients were treated. During the first year, 170 babies were born, 85 boys, 85 girls. So it was a great shock to the community when the hospital burned on January 29, 1948. Apparently, faulty wiring was the cause. 18 adult patients and 6 babies, including newborn twins, were quickly evacuated to nearby homes, but the hospital could not be saved. In spite of immense sadness in the community, planning and fundraising began at once for a new hospital, this one to be built below the escarpment for easier winter access and for better water pressure. The stage was set for West Lincoln Memorial Hospital, as it is now and as it will be in the future.
In closing this session, we will remember those who served and one other interesting story from the Independent. From Grimsby, 549 men and women enlisted, 373 served overseas, 144 served in Canada, 32 were discharged, and 33 were killed in action. Finally, many of you may know the name Margaret Gibson. She was a teacher at Grimsby High School for quite some time, and she was also involved in the startup of the Grimsby Historical Society. But did you know that at the beginning of the war, she was studying in Sweden? When war broke out, the students were going to be rushed home. Margaret wired her mom that she would be on SS Athenia. The Athenia was torpedoed with a huge loss of life. Imagine the shock Margaret's mom got when her daughter phoned her from Halifax. She'd been transferred to a different ship, the Empress of Australia. You can read more of our stories of World War II on our webpage at grimsbyhistoricalsociety.com in the drop-down tab, Life in Grimsby. And we thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, ladies. Very enjoyable.
Thank you.
And Dorothy, I don't know if you want to mention more about your, just in the last slide here, just your new book, More Gleanings from Grimsby.
Well, it's available from the Grimsby Historical Society online store. You can either have it mailed out to you, or you can arrange to pick it up at the library, at the archives. The Grimsby Museum also has copies, and also Cocoon and Objects of Desire downtown. So I do hope you will go and get a copy and learn an awful lot more about Grimsby. Certainly we at the archives have learned a tremendous amount since they've Walters and I started in 1999. So much information has come out. It's wonderful. And we're glad to share it. That's why we're here, is to share the information we get. So thank you very much. And the book is only $20, so it's a great Christmas gift.
Well, on behalf of the Grimsby Public Library, I'd like to thank Ev and Dorothy for their wonderful presentation, bringing to light some stories that are local and kind of, you know, these are huge world events, and it's nice to get the small stories that make up yeah, these big events. So I know Ev and Dorothy are happy to take questions. Feel free to type anything you want in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself to ask a question, that's totally fine too. And feel free to just put comments in the chat too. I know the one thing we miss with these Zoom presentations is they don't get to you know, have that applause at the end. So I know you know, it's you know, we certainly appreciate what they're you know, all the work that goes into putting these presentations together.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to just add when Ed was talking about Ada Bromley and her servicemen, that I wanted to say the first Christmas that my brother was overseas with the RCAF, my father called Mount Hope and asked if they would send an airman for Christmas dinner. And they said, well, would you take 3? So we did. We had 3 of these guys from England, and they made our house sort of their center when they were on leave, whether it was for a few hours or overnight, they would come. And it was great. It was a great experience to have them. Yeah.
So Dorothy and Ev, there's a question from Nicole here. It says, we have a question here. What happens to many of the children who were sent over to Europe, or sorry, over from Europe to Canada, and did any of them end up in Grimsby?
I don't know of any that ended in Grimsby. Maybe somebody does and can tell us. But as far as I know, they were still minors. You know, they would have probably been 14 or 15 years old when the war ended. So they would have gone home to their families there. I know the ones that I knew at Earl Kitchener did. Yeah, they were only here for the sake of safety, not to be adopted or anything like that.
There's a comment from Sandra, just thanking you both for presenting tonight. Did anyone else have any questions? Okay, well, I'll just sort of slowly start to wrap it up, but feel free to chime in if you do have a question or pop it in the chat. Just once again, I would like to thank Ev and Dorothy for doing the talk tonight. I think it's a great way to commemorate Remembrance Day. And yeah, and I just, you know, I know the Historical Society in general has done a lot of research on this topic, and it's great that you're able to share it with the community this way.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for letting us do this.
Thanks. This was great. Thanks so much for putting this together.
Okay.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, well, I'll end the Zoom meeting here, and I hope everybody has a good night, and yeah, and just stay safe and take care. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, bye for now.
Have a good
Bye-bye.
night.